Genesis chapter 18, and I'm going to be reading verses 16 through 33. Please listen carefully, but this is God's word. Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grave, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know." Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, "Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" So the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes." Then Abraham answered and said, "Indeed, now I who am but dust and ashes have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than the 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for a lack of 5? So he said, "If I find there 45, I will not destroy it." And he spoke to him yet again and said, "Suppose there should be 40 found there." So he said, "I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, "Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there." So he said, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." And he said, "Indeed, now I have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there." So he said, "I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, Let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, "I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham. And Abraham returned to his place. So the quiet, gracious, busy host, Abraham, remember last week he stood by and had a big meal prepared for his guests, one being the Lord of glory. And he now becomes the bold and brash questioner of the Lord. In verse 1 through 15, the question is anything too hard for the Lord? But now we get into verses 16 and 33, and the question Abraham is asking is, shall not the judge of all the earth give right judgment? And look at verse 16. It says, "Then the men rose from there and looked toward Sodom, and Abraham went with them to send them on the way." We see Abraham, after, maybe we call it fellowship, dining is always a sign of fellowship with the Lord. Now he walks with God like Enoch did back in Genesis 5:24. And a principle behind that would be, when we have fellowship with the Lord, it creates obedience. Otherwise, it's in vain. When you have that quiet time with the Lord, you feel energized. You feel you're ready to conquer the world for Christ. At least you should feel that way. And when you feel that way, you've just had an intimate time with the Lord. And it will lead to obedience. This is what's happening with Abraham. In verses 17 through 19, he says, and the Lord said, notice it's all capital, meaning maybe I'll say, and Yahweh said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? Since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. For I have known him, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord, of the way of Yahweh, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. So here in verse 17 through 19, and actually the rest of the narrative, both God and Abraham express mutual concerns. Can God trust Abraham? And can Abraham trust God? And to both those questions, the answer is yes. That Abraham is developing that personal, intimate relationship with Yahweh. When God purposes something, remember this, especially as you go through this, when God purposes something, and it seems like he's not sure about it, he does this out of kindness to us. Because he's already decided what he's going to do. He's God. He's God Almighty. He never has to learn anything. And so the way the Bible is written, like right here between Abraham and God, it seems like God doesn't know what he's going to do. But it speaks that way for our benefit. So we get an insight in who God is. Now we see Sodom. While Sodom is unharmed and enjoying its pleasant luxuries, the Lord announces to his servant, friend Abraham, that soon it's going to perish. Soon this city has no clue that it's about ready to meet me in judgment, is about ready to perish. Come to think of it, it's like Jonathan Edwards when he made that sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. And what he meant by that is there are people, multitudes of people, it's like they're in a spider web, and the web is ready, can break at any moment. And they don't realize how close each individual is to judgment. Because life can be taken away just like that. And then, what does it say in Romans 9:27? After this, after death, then the judgment. There's no second chance after death. And so there is no doubt what God is doing to Abraham is he's showing him that nothing happens by chance. But it's all by God's actions and will. And although the Lord keeps, he has to, he keeps much of the future hidden from us, he also desires us to be eyewitnesses of his acts in history, in time. In verse 20 and 21 it says, and the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very great, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me. And if not, I will know. So the Lord is beginning to explain even in more detail to Abraham his will concerning the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. We need to always remember this. God's actions are not controlled by a sudden impulse of an emotional outburst. Okay, that's how we react to things because we're creatures. God never acts like that. But everything he does is according to his justice and righteousness. And they're always measured. God's righteous and justice is always measured by his wisdom, by his patience, and by his holiness. So whatever God does is according to these three attributes of who he is. It's by wisdom that something happens in this world. Judgment or whatever it is. What he's about to do to Sodom and Gomorrah is according to his wisdom. Everything God does, and it's what Abraham has to learn, it's what we all have to learn, everything God does is righteous and good. Everything. We don't know all the details behind everything. God does. And he's patient. God is everlasting kindness and patience. Patience knows no bounds. Beloved, when we get to heaven, we're going to finally get I'll say a glimpse of how much God really hates sin. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to marvel how patient he was, not only to us, but the entire humanity. The angels are. The angels can't believe of God's patience, how patient he is, and of his holiness. God's holiness, he does everything out of his holiness. He's never going to compromise justice. He's never going to compromise with anything. That is why, as Marcia was mentioning today in Sunday school, God's justice was bore out on Jesus Christ. His holiness. And you see, he can't just let Judy into heaven just because he's a nice guy. Justice has to be demanded for Judy's sin. And so Jesus Christ took Judy's sin and went to the cross. The physical aspect of the cross was horrible. But the spiritual aspect of it was beyond our comprehension. That's why it went dark. So no one could see what was happening on that cross. Because what was happening on that cross was Jesus Christ, the sinless God, was suffering my punishment that I should have in hell. And that is why, beloved, Joel Paul goes to heaven and would never have to suffer hell because Jesus Christ did for him. It's huge. So everything the Lord does, there's his actions we can never question. We might question, you know what I mean. The Lord knows, let me put it this way, the Lord knows the extent in which we love and honor him. He knows. He knows your heart better than you know it, obviously. He knows how much Marcia loves and honors him. But he wants you to demonstrate that honor and love in our praise and service. You see, he already knows how much you love him, but he wants, it's for our benefit, that he knows what's good for us. So he wants Tex to honor him in praise and love. He knows what's in Tex's heart, but he wants for his benefit to express it outwardly. And that's what he's kind of doing here with Abraham. He already knows what he's going to do. He's doing this intercessory for Abraham's benefit and for our benefit. Likewise, God doesn't need to be urged to do justice by Abraham. It's not like Abraham saying, hey, God, you know, if you're really just, then would you allow this, this, and this? The discussion takes place so that Abraham can himself consider the issues of justice. It's for Abraham's sake that God goes into this dialogue. So that Abraham's now thinking about, I'm beginning to understand God's justice now. You see how patient he is with us? See how loving he is with us? God was not ignorant of what was going on in Sodom. He wasn't ignorant. But he would handle the situation in a just and righteous way, and that's what he wants us to understand. The Lord desires to demonstrate that his decision to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah was fully justified and not something done on a whim. It's not something done on an emotional outburst by God. The Holy One emphasized the depth of Sodom and Gomorrah's sin. He said it's grave. It's a horrible sin. And these sins did include horrendous sexual sins. We get our basic word from sodomy here. That's where we get the word sodomy. Sodom and Gomorrah also only cared about themselves, while they brutalized and oppressed each other. We do that in America. We do it everywhere. The unborn are killed before they can even see the world God has made. The elderly are encouraged to go on with dying so that the young can take their place. That's how self-absorbed we are. We have outward sins that God will bring us to judgment, but there's also those inward sins of indifference that he's going to judge us for. God has already confirmed earlier that he's omniscient when he read Sarah's heart. Remember? It's some of my favorite verses in the Bible. You laughed, Sarah, when Sarah laughed inside of herself, and she was scared. I didn't laugh. The Lord, yes, you did laugh in your heart. So he has no problem understanding the depths of people's sins. He knew the depths of Sodom and Gomorrah's sins. The Lord knows everything because he's ordained it. But through a huge act of condescension, he responds for our sake. He's on our level, if you want to put it that way, so that we begin to understand what he's doing. Abraham is learning that God bases his judgment on full, accurate information. Remember I said he knows all the details going on. We don't, but he does. So God, he sends his angels, that's what the other two were, angels, on a fact-finding mission to gather information he already knew. He does this he gives us the word of God for our benefit. It's like God's baby talk to us. Now, remember this. God spoke to Abraham 3 times. Back in Genesis 15:2, 15:8, and 17:17. And each time, his personal welfare has been the subject of discourse. It's always been about his welfare. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. But now look how Abraham is growing in the faith. Because now Abraham's concerned with the welfare of others. And not only others, but total strangers. And he displays, Abraham does, an awareness of the suffering and the inability to respond beyond his own immediate personal interests. He's involved in the interests of others he doesn't even know. Abraham now stands before God, and he's pleading for the lives of pagan strangers. He senses the kingship he has with the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he feels himself involved in the same fate. And that's principle number 1 about intercessory prayer. Principle number 1 is that the more a Christian grows in their intimate relationship with the Lord, the more they realize they're no better than anybody else. That they're sinners just like everybody else is. And we were once in that position. There's 4 principles that I glean out of this, why he goes to the Lord in intercessory prayer. And principle 1 is Abraham understands he's no better than the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. That he deserves divine justice. But because of God's grace, because of God saving him, he's not going to do that. But he doesn't hold it over other non-believers. Saying, look at me, I'm going to heaven. The Lord is working in his heart that he now feels compassion towards those that don't have that relationship with God. You remember verse 22 when it says, then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom. But Abraham still stood before the Lord. Abraham came forward, or maybe in some translations as drew near. And in Hebrew, that word is used in a courtroom sense. It's a legal term. And it refers to the heart and mind reaching out to God in worship and confession. Abraham is intensely interceding on behalf of others. That's what Abraham is doing. But we have to always remember, too, that many times when God promises to punish a group of people, he often involves us, the believer and the non-believer, in the same punishment. In the same punishment. That's why it's dangerous to say, well, this person is a Christian, but look how that person was punished by the Lord, along with all those others. No, because remember Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra, and others throughout the Bible who worship God in truth also was suddenly taken into exile. They suffered right along with the unrighteous. But here's principle number 2 in intercessory prayer. Abraham's intercessory prayer is instructive for us. Because far too often, and I'm guilty of this, far too often we pray as if we must overcome God's reluctance rather than seize upon his willingness. You see, God's stirring Abraham up to come to him and intercede on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah because of his willingness. And God, sometimes we think, I have to talk God into something. I have to somehow get over God's reluctance. No, the reason God is working in you to pray for other people is because he's seizing upon God's willingness. Principle number 3 is the fact that the Lord was the one who brought up this situation and revealing the cities. Abraham now is literally convinced of eternal judgment. And that is what principle 3 is in intercessory prayer. That we know there's a true hell. That we know people are going to perish and go to hell if they don't repent and believe in Jesus Christ. And that should make us intercede for other people, that fact alone. In verse 24, 23, 24, let's see. And Abraham came near and said, would you destroy the righteous and the wicked? That's one I just went over. But verses 24 and 25, suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous would be as the wicked. Far be it from you. You shall not the judge of all the earth do right? See, these two verses reveal that Abraham was concerned about the righteous, about believers within Sodom and Gomorrah also. And he did have an underlying concern for Lot. He did. That's why you say that he was interceding for Lot. But his sense of justice didn't stop only with his immediate family. You see, he knew God's justice. So he's not only praying for Lot and his family, he was praying for everybody in Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham prayed not only for Lot, but for the rest of the people in Sodom and Gomorrah. And he was demonstrating what you could say a God-like compassion for others. And that's what God puts in us, is that God-like compassion for other people. That's why Marcia said, did I just blow that chance to witness to that person to that extent? That's having a God-like compassion for other people. He had no doubt, though, that God is the author of all righteousness and justice. He's beginning to see that now. And he's convinced now that the Lord cannot and will not do wrong. When God pours out his, we're going to see this when we get to heaven. We're going to know that everything God does was for not only a purpose, for his glory. This is principle number 4. God is righteous in his being and just in his actions. When you truly believe that God is righteous and just, then you're going to intercede on behalf of other people. It's God putting in your heart to intercede for another person, another situation, and you know hell is real, and you know that God is righteous and just. It's a way that we reflect Christ. But look at verses 26 through 33. It says, so the Lord said, if I find in Sodom 50 righteous within the city, then I will spare all the place for their sakes. Then Abraham answered and said, indeed now, I who am but dust and ashes have taken it upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose there were 5 less than 50 righteous. Would you destroy all the city for the lack of 5? So he said, if I find there 45, I will not destroy it. And he spoke to him yet again and said, suppose there should be 40 found there. So he said, I will not do it for the sake of 40. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 should be found there. So he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, indeed, now I have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 should be found there. So he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. Then he said, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak but once more. Suppose 10 should be found there. And he said, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. So the Lord went his way as soon as he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. It looks like Abraham's boldness is growing as he wrestled with God in this intercessory prayer. It's what Jacob will later do in Genesis 32 when he wrestled with the angel. Remember that? And got his hip dislocated. We have to understand, beloved, that God hears the cries of humanity. He does. He hears the cry of the baby as it suffers abuse. He hears the cry of an old man getting beaten on the streets. He hears the cries of the teenage girl that when she's compromised. He hears the cries of the abandoned wife. God hears them all. Even the whimpers and the silent screams, God hears it. Make no mistake about it. And because God hears, and because he knows all, judgment is coming. And nobody gets out of anything. As sure as God is righteous and just, judgment is coming. Still, with that fact, and I think just about everybody knows, nothing is more offensive to the unbelieving heart than the coming judgment. And that's why, beloved, when you're making intercessory prayer, you realize there's a real hell. And you realize that. And it's not uncommon, I don't know if you've heard this before, but Abraham seems to be maybe stereotyped as some type of wheeler-dealer bargaining with God. But Abraham's not asking God in his mercy to acquit the city. He's not asking that. For this would treat the righteous and wicked alike. Notice what he's saying in the intercessory. This intercessory prayer is by a man, a person who is described as God's friend and who's growing little in his own eyes while God is consuming all of his thoughts. Abraham, once the judgment falls on Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham's not going to complain and say, why'd you take the wicked away? He's going to start seeing how much God really hates sin. So let me go over these really fast, the 4 principles. Principle 1 is realizing we're sinners and we're just like all others. And that we deserve punishment just like anybody else does, but the grace of God we're saved. By Christ's sinless life, we're not going to suffer the punishment. Number 2, we seek to seize on God's willingness to intervene. That's why he stirred you up to pray for other people. Number 3, we're convinced of eternal judgment. We're convinced that there's a real hell. We need to intercede for people. And 4, God is righteous and just in all that he does. When you go and intercede for a situation God has placed on your heart, whatever the outcome is in that intercessory prayer, we're never going to complain and think God should have done something different. Because you're in an effective intercessory prayer, you realize God is righteous and just in all that he does and allows.